The last time I worked on this project, I was experimenting with using the Titebond 2 wood glue to glue the canvas both to just the plain old foam, as well as glue it to the PL300 construction adhesive. I wanted to find out if it would bond well enough to the construction adhesive that I could use the adhesive for making fillets. So one of the things I was also talking about was, how do I know if things are strong enough? And one way I know the glue up is strong enough is if when I try to separate the materials, the foam actually tears apart. Because if the foam is ripping apart from itself, then I can't glue any stronger than that. There's no need to adhere something twice as strong if the underlying foam can't handle anymore. So, one thing to note here is that this is very stiff where I did the glue up, which was part of the intention of doing the glue up. I can compare that to just doing this by hand and it feels stronger. That's not very scientific. I did actually, on one of my other channels once, do measurements where I actually put weights on here to measure the deflection. And I'll put a link to that in the comments if you really care about the nitty-gritty details. But suffice to say, gluing the canvas on here does actually provide a lot of rigidity to the overall mechanism. So the question now is, can I successfully peel this off, and will it bring up foam when I do? And the answer is yes. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but there's kind of shininess here all across the back of this. And that is, in fact, the foam itself. There's a few places where I can see the raw canvas underneath, but that definitely tore the top layer of the foam off. It's got that green color and everything. So I think that we can't really adhere any more strongly than that because I just destroyed the foam itself. Now let's try taking the canvas off of this construction adhesive and see how that works out. So you can see here that the glue definitely held very well to the construction adhesive. The construction adhesive, however, peeled fairly easily off the foam. That is annoying, and I'm not quite sure what to do about it. Another option I considered was making fillets by mixing plaster of Paris with the wood glue. This is a trick that a lot of people use. It helps the plaster of Paris really stick to the foam, which is good, and it cures and you get a nice molded thing. The problem with the plaster of Paris is that even after it's dry, it is just very porous and wants to suck up a lot of water. And so in order to prevent it from absorbing all that water, you then have to somehow coat it with something, epoxy or something, to make it water impenetrable. And given that the rest of this is built out of foam, which is already pretty impenetrable to water, I'm not sure that I want to put something on that's going to act like a big sponge and just suck up water. Another issue with the plaster of Paris is that it could cure too well and become too hard. The foam here is always going to be a little bit flexible, and so one advantage of this foam board stuff is that it is flexible, so as the structure wiggles around, the foam board adhesive will have a little bit of pliability to it. If I had something that was hard made out of the plaster of Paris, then when things shift around, it's going to have a tendency to crack rather than yield. We're now looking at the attempt I made to use wood glue and a hardener in order to fill in gaps here. And we can see that one of the problems is it has really shrunk a lot. This is another issue with trying to use different things to fill the foam in, is it might look good at first, but over time it shrinks down and now you no longer have a nice fair surface. I think on the camera you can see it even better from this angle, just how wobbly this is in here. So it is hard and it is probably pretty well adhered, but it took a long time to dry, it's got cracks in it, and it shrunk a lot. A rather expensive solution would be to use epoxy. I'm going to do this in part because I just need to test that this epoxy and hardener are still good, and so rather than let it dry in the cup, which doesn't really do much for me, I can actually put it on here and either it will work or it won't, but at least I'll get a lot more information that way, both about whether or not my epoxy is good and how well it works on here. Now the rumor is that epoxy should work really well on the XPS foam. There's a whole cottage industry of people who build their own surfboards using XPS foam and epoxy and fiberglass. I am still going to be using canvas instead of fiberglass, but I'm going to use the epoxy, and this will be kind of a good test because if my epoxy is good and it works, it will sort of give me an example of what would be the maybe best possible thing. I don't know that I'd be able to do better than epoxy. So it sort of gives me a high watermark, even though it's too expensive to use for the amount that I need to do. These pumps are not working so well, which is concerning because epoxy, unlike polyester resin, needs a very precise ratio. With polyester, adding more and less hardener can affect how long it takes to cure. With the epoxy, having more or less hardener will just prevent it from curing entirely. It's not a factor that you want to mess around with. There's a very specific correct ratio that you want to use, and anything other than that ratio is just going to reduce performance. I'm going to stir this for 120 stirs or so, and then I'll be back. In this little cup, I've got the 205 fast hardener and epoxy mixed with the high density filler. I'm going to use that to make my fillet. This is the remainder of the epoxy in 205. And then in this one, I have the 206. The 206 is a lot newer than the 205. The 205 is several years old. So I'm going to start by just putting a nice fillet in here. Well, hopefully a nice one. I'm going to start by trying to put a nice fillet in here. What I may do is make a gigantic mess. I'm now going to wet out this canvas as if it was fiberglass. I'm doing this on top of wax paper because the epoxy won't really stick to that. Plus I can just throw out the wax paper. I'm going to do half of this with the slow hardener. Actually, this is the fast hardener now. I'm going to do half of this with the fast hardener and half with the slow hardener because I want to know if both of them are working. So this wets out pretty easily. Let's flip it over. It did go through, but it could use more on this side anyways. One issue with this canvas is it is just getting little bits of string coming off of it. Now I'm going to wet out the rest of this with the slow hardener. That was a very wet on wet layup. What I would probably consider doing if I was going to do this more is let the fillet dry a lot more until it was tacky, because when I put this on I was probably squishing stuff and maybe creating air bubbles where the canvas meets the fillet. But I didn't want to have to mix up multiple batches here, so I just did it all at once. And the real test here is just making sure that all my epoxy and hardeners are still working and just seeing how well the canvas adheres to the foam. Now that I'm done playing with foam and epoxy, it's time to get back to the pirate ship. Last time I sanded this and then wiped it down with water, but you can see that there's still a lot of dust, especially with these black gloves. You can see there's still a ton of fiberglass dust on top of this. The next step is I'm going to wipe it down with some denatured alcohol. This is just stuff that I actually use in my alcohol stove. You'll see some people use acetone or other things, but the denatured alcohol is cheap. It's nice to work with compared to acetone. It doesn't smell horrible. And I've heard rumors that it's better for the epoxy anyways. That is something that is hugely controversial, and you will find no clear answers on the internet. Somebody told me that they called West Systems and asked, and West Systems said use denatured alcohol, not acetone. That's all I know.